Um, I'd like to thank you, everyone, and it's my honor to introduce our guest speaker today.
I have no bio.
Huh? Okay. We have Dr. Joannie Dobbs giving us a presentation today on the under-recognized role of essential nutrients in health and healthcare. Dr. Joannie Dobbs is Assistant Specialist at the Human Nutrition, Food and Animal Science Department of the University of Hawaii, College of Tropical Agriculture and Human Resources. Dr. Dobbs also is former chair of HONSAC and emeritus member, and we're very happy to have her here with us today. Everybody, help me welcome Dr. Joannie Dobbs.
Hey.
Thanks, John. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be able to share with all of you my passion for this topic. The under-recognized role of essential nutrients in health care is a growing topic, but a lot of people don't actually realize it. And I want to make that point because a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is trying to get you to understand essential nutrients, which even our students at the university do all right on the exams, but they don't quite understand what that actually means. So the goals today is to make you aware of the importance of consuming all required essential nutrients. And yes, essential means required, but these are required relatively often, some daily, others not daily. And adequate calories. The whole focus nationwide has been on obesity to the point where we're seeing lots of malnutrition and it's not being recognized frequently. That in the long term will affect long-term health. Also to show how nutrition affects both health maintenance and health care. All right, so moving on. Essentially, health and nutrition concepts. What is health? These are the things we're going to go through. Essential nutrients, food composition, and bioavailability. All three of these areas of nutrition need to be understood so that proper recommendations are made. Nutrition recommendations that are being given to the public, sometimes detrimentally, and then examples of common conditions affected by inadequate nutrition. One of the things that I want to point out right off, these are just examples. I could give you thousands of examples. I'm giving you just some key examples so that you understand coming down the line. So what is health? We all seem to know, but we get very different answers when we ask people. So in 1970, there was a definition. Health is the complete physical, mental, social well-being of an individual. It was also an implicit goal of the society is the enhancement of each person's opportunity for a healthy, reasonably happy, and productive life. All right, so these two came out of a meeting on Health of Americans in 1970. More simplistically, health is being physically, mentally, and emotionally able to live a full life. And I think that's important as more individuals may have certain handicaps in life, understanding that these handicaps don't need to hold you back. All right, so what's nutrition? We all seem to know that. We all eat food. But the definition, essentially, the simplistic definition is all interactions between a living organism and its food. All of the interrelated steps by which an organism assimilates food and uses that food for growth, tissue repair, and replacement. All right, and elaboration of products. So as an example, you know, a mother producing milk for her child, that's an elaboration of products. By far the single most important concept relating to health and to nutrition is homeostasis. Now, some of you may be familiar with this term, others may not. Most people, when you say homeostasis, say, oh, regular temperature regulation, not an issue. But it's much more than that. Essentially, Rudolf Schonheimer essentially came out with the definition, the formal definition, which is body components remain constant in amount and chemical composition, all right, even with constant turnover. So, for an example, the calcium in your skeleton wasn't there 7 years ago. The calcium in your skeleton now will not be there 7 years from now. You have to keep replenishing that calcium, or we find when homeostasis is no longer stable, we end up with osteopenia, osteoporosis, and other problems. Homeostasis is really important and allows the body to do a couple things. So it allows you to have a constant internal temperature. That's really important for metabolism. Also, it allows you to have a normal blood composition. And as I say, with that calcium that we were talking about from bones, that's really the storage for your blood calcium, which also helps your heart beat, right? There's a calcium channel. So what's really important here is that if you don't get calcium in your diet, your bones can then provide the calcium into the blood so it keeps constant. Repair and rejuvenation is going on. So the gastrointestinal tract, which turns over about every 3 days, the cells, that's equal to cells equaling a tennis court, 1 layer thick. So if you're not obtaining the nutrients from the diet, the turnover of cells may in fact provide long-term problems in terms of repair of the GI tract. Obviously, your hair grows and skin is repaired and turned over. And then the production of neurochemicals, your brain chemicals, which are really important both to prevent depression, to allow sleep. These chemicals are produced by the body, and homeostasis is critical for keeping normal levels. Now, also responding appropriately to both internal and environmental. So if we don't have enough hydration during the day, thirst should help us maintain that internal regulation. But also, if we cut ourselves and we didn't have all the chemical reactions going on all the time, we would probably bleed to death before they could get up and running at an appropriate speed. So homeostasis, how does it work? Essentially, it works through 2 additional terms, catabolism, which essentially is the breakdown of body components, and anabolism. And it's important that these balance out each other. It's how we remain the same even though we're constantly turning over. Now, metabolism is thrown around. You have a high metabolism, a low metabolism. But what does it really mean? Metabolism is another term essentially referring to all of life's sustaining chemical reactions. All right? And that's important to maintain homeostasis. All right? So in order to repair and stay young, many of these chemical reactions require energy from the diet. All right? So oftentimes people will restrict too far and it affects metabolism. This is just a slide to give you an idea. This is just literally about 1.5 inches of a metabolic chart that I've got blown up on the wall that runs around 10 feet by 8 feet. These are the chemical reactions in the body, and these are all regulated by nutrients, oftentimes vitamins and minerals. So homeostasis requires this constant flow of nutrients to maintain itself. Now, we're all interested as we're getting older in terms of aging. And during aging, homeostasis changes. So what you end up seeing and on your handouts, etc., is you see basal metabolic rate. We require less calories. you see a number of different things change: temperature regulation and the amount of muscle someone has. You also see that you get a number of blood pressure issues happening, as well as in terms of the volume the heart has to pump. Obviously, if your heart is having to pump harder and harder to get blood circulating, you're going to get a change in size, because remember, heart is a muscle. What we do know from other studies is as long as we maintain in individuals adequate muscle mass, most of these other changes don't occur, or they occur much slower. So the important thing is to make sure that everyone's diet has adequate nutrients to maintain or even build muscle, which we know even into the 90s, individuals can build a muscle mass with appropriate exercise and weightlifting, as long as all of the nutrients are there to do it. Health and nutrition concepts, we're now on to point 2. We've got 3 areas: essential nutrients, food composition, and bioavailability. So what exactly is that essential nutrient? Too frequently we hear about what we shouldn't be eating, but what's an essential nutrient? All right, so essential nutrients are substances that the body requires for that normal function. And yes, I've already alluded to that with homeostasis, but it cannot be made from other substances or cannot make enough to meet the body's needs. So in some cases, the body can in fact synthesize it, but not at an adequate rate to prevent problems from happening. There are 2 things that happen when someone is not getting adequate amounts of an essential nutrient. 1, inadequate intake of an essential nutrient will result in deficiency signs and symptoms. Sadly, we don't always think about it until it's at the far extreme. So when the sign is very obvious or the symptom is very obvious. The second thing is that a sign or symptom is reversed when the nutrient is reintroduced and healthy body stores are at least partially replenished. Now, there are some problems with replenishing because in some cases, when someone is deficient in multiple different nutrients, the gastrointestinal tract is not replenished adequately. And therefore, you might consume the food, but it doesn't get absorbed into the body. Now, we talk about 6 key areas. So water, protein, carbohydrate, fat, vitamins, and minerals. You can't just eliminate any of these. So many people today are going on non-fat diets. Well, non-fat diets affect all types of things, including the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins. And some people are doing it pretty extreme. So it's important to keep in mind you can't do that. But what are the key functions, the main functions of these groups? So in terms of, we look at 3 big areas: source of energy. We look also at growth and maintenance of tissues, all right? And then we also look at regulation of body processes, how fast these processes will happen, or metabolism. Now, water doesn't have any calories, but it is important for the other 2 functions, growth and maintenance of tissues, and regulation. So if someone is dehydrated, they're going to affect a fair amount of processes in the body. As individuals get older, they lose their thirst mechanism. It is not appropriate to say, drink when you're thirsty. When you're younger, thirst kicks in when your body water is around 3% low. But older, it may not kick in at all. And that affects a lot of things, including interpretation of medical tests. Protein is a source of energy and also is important for growth and repair and maintenance of tissues and regulation of of body processes. Lipids, again, just like protein, are important for all three of these functions. Carbohydrate is pretty much just for energy, all right, not totally. And obviously, if you look at fiber and carbohydrate, fiber, we have a debate in the nutrition world. Older nutritionists say it's not an essential nutrient because there actually are populations that have gone without consuming fiber and have not had issues. But we have to say that fiber definitely does promote gastrointestinal health in many times. So that's sort of the one nutrient that maybe it's essential or not. But glucose, a breakdown product from starches and sugars, are really important for both the brain and the red blood cell. So individuals trying to get all the sugar out of their diet may or may not be appropriate as well. Vitamins are really based about that speed, that metabolism, that regulation of processes. So vitamin deficiencies are going to affect that. And then we have minerals, which play two roles. Obviously, calcium makes up part of your skeleton, with protein making up, essentially the structure, and calcium filling in for strength. But also minerals play a big role in terms of regulation as well. So we have to keep in mind that these have different nutrient contents, caloric contents. And why that's important is, which I'll show in a slide a little later, is that we've got protein and we've got carbohydrate that are equal in calories per gram consumed, not when you chemically analyze it, but how the body uses it. They come out to be about the same. Fiber is not digested except by your GI tract microorganisms, so there is a little bit of energy to fiber. But on a whole, other carbohydrates we say are about 4. Lipid has more than twice the amount of energy, which is why lots of people think they need to just eliminate it if they want to lose weight. And then oftentimes people don't think about alcohol. And alcohol has nearly the energy content of fat or lipids. And so that's another place where individuals are getting calories in their diet. Now, the next slide showing the macro and micronutrients, and I'm doing this not to read all of them, but too frequently people forget that we have between 45 and 50 essential nutrients. And why we don't have an exact number is that we're still trying to figure out some of the really trace amounts. This type of research is very difficult. We know in some animals, some of the trace nutrients are required. It's not as easy to do that work in humans. Getting an approval to find out if this happens to be an essential nutrient in a human might cross over that line in terms of ethics. So since all animal species don't have the same trace element requirements, we don't know that for sure. So going back now, all right, so we've dealt with essential nutrients. Food composition, where does that play a role in overall health? And everyone has probably seen the My Plate, where we're talking about 5 food groups. Essentially, we're talking about a protein group, a vegetable group, a fruit group, a grains group, and dairy. This is essentially to get all of these nutrients. And there's been a fair amount of work showing that the greater the variety in the diet, the greater your chance of getting all the nutrients from the diet. Eliminating even one of these groups or decreasing it too dramatically actually can have some detrimental effects. And so if we look at the different food groups, as an example, if we look at the meat and meat alternative group, it provides protein and fat, And then we have a number of B vitamins, thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, folate, B12, and vitamin A. In the meat alternative group, the B12 is added into it. B12 is only in animal flesh and some in dairy. We've got vitamin A, D, heme iron. Heme iron is the iron that's readily absorbed. That's only in the darker red flesh meat. So chicken breast has very little heme iron, where chicken thigh has a lot, or beef. Zinc and magnesium. Now, by far, these are not all the nutrients, and the milk area obviously are missing thiamine and niacin, but it adds in calcium, which you didn't have in the meat group. The grains group now doesn't have the lipids, and it doesn't have the B12 or vitamin A or vitamin D. So you can see in the first three groups, none of them are complete. And then the fourth group we have as well, we're missing quite a few in the fruits and vegetables. Oftentimes people ask me what I consider the most essential nutrient. I'd say water. In just a few days without water, whether it's coming from actual water or a beverage or food, you're going to have problems happening, including death. What we see, however, I would put protein next because it does play such an important role in so many areas. Fruits and vegetables are important for long-term health. They're not above the need of protein, although from lots of the public health messages, you might get that idea. Oh, let me go back one second. Although these are not all the nutrients, what a group of nutrition researchers around 20 years ago, when they came out initially with the food guide pyramid, they sat down with all the nutrients, and they realized if individuals were getting adequate amounts of these nutrients, the other ones were also covered. So typically you look to make sure people are getting this complement of nutrients, and then you know the other trace minerals, etc., will be covered. All right, so now we're on to the area of bioavailability. And this is an area that is almost completely ignored in even textbooks today, which is pretty sad because it becomes really, really important on what you're actually absorbing. That tube that goes into your mouth and through your body is just a tube. It has to get absorbed before it's important. So recommendations today frequently, they're essentially made to assure nutrient adequacy, but they are not based on the fact that bioavailability. They look at the total content of the nutrient in the food, but not the total available. This becomes really important, and the result is very, very misleading. And I'll bring up some examples that all of you will clearly identify with. So nutrient bioavailability, the definition, would be the amount of ingested nutrient that can be digested, absorbed, and then used, okay, assimilated. The amount does not equal the amount consumed. And let me give you, I'm sure all of us have heard Popeye say how important spinach was, right? Isn't that how Popeye built his muscles? Spinach does not equal beef in any way, shape, or form in terms of iron bioavailability. So even though when you look at the total iron content of spinach, we're talking fresh spinach here, you get 2.43 milligrams, tiny amount, but we only need a tiny amount, per 3-ounce serving. So that's about 3 cups of fresh spinach. And if you look at a 3-ounce burger, it has 2.21 milligrams iron for 3 ounces. Now, in one study that I presented at a meeting, most websites, actually 55% out of 100 websites of hospitals recommended spinach actually as equal to beef. Okay, But if we look at the bioavailability, spinach bioavailability is 2%, the iron. That equals 0.049 milligrams, where it's 20% in beef. And that means it's 0.442 milligrams. That's a huge difference. The recommendations that were previously made and came out with our recommendations that you'll see on supplements or on the food facts panels, etc., is based on 18 milligrams a day, and that was based on approximately 20% of your iron coming from heme iron. So when individuals stop consuming heme iron, your requirement actually almost doubles for iron intake to prevent malnutrition. So how are nutrition recommendations made? And essentially we have a large set of volumes of nutrition information. What happens is a committee is formed, and every few years they review all the past information. And then they also look at all the new information. And they decide whether or not requirements should be modified. So as an example, about 15 years ago, they actually lowered the requirement for iron to 15 milligrams and realized, oh, this isn't good. We're seeing a lot more iron deficiency occur. In cases of vitamin C, they actually increased the vitamin C requirement in the last 10 years based on the fact that they were seeing more problems occur with blood values that they thought were appropriate for vitamin C, but were no longer considered that way. I want to go very briefly over something that we essentially call the recommended dietary allowance, not daily allowance, dietary allowance. And essentially it's a bell-shaped curve in terms of the population. So as we're looking at the area for estimated average requirement, 50% of the population would be getting adequate amounts if they consumed that amount of the nutrient. And 2 standard deviations take you to the recommended dietary allowance, or about 97%. That still means that there are individuals who have a higher requirement for all types of reasons that are over and above that RDA. All right? That's important to understand, because in our own healthcare system, frequently individuals may be taking amounts that meet the RDA, but possibly they're taking something as simple as a birth control pills, which change some nutrients. We don't think of a birth control pill or think of some of the different painkillers as being anything but a normal situation, but in fact can modify the requirements and put individuals into that level above the 97%. Now I want to also mention upper limit. Now this is important because some people think if a little is good, a whole lot more is better. And that's not necessarily true at all. And we see that happening. Now this is going to also affect the bioavailability. There are a number of nutrients that very detrimentally affect iron. As an example, we've got calcium, very strong inhibitor of both heme iron and non-heme iron. So that burger may be really good in terms of getting heme iron, put a piece of cheese on it, and you've just dropped what you can actually absorb much lower. All right? And then the same way, vitamin C can enhance non-heme iron absorption. So there are things that enhance and inhibit, but too much vitamin C are linked with other problems in the body. So being careful. Zinc, which is also an essential nutrient, and frequently people are doing lots of zinc lozenge around the time of flu and colds, actually also inhibits iron. But if you're taking too much iron, It can also inhibit zinc absorption. So nutrients play a role in affecting each other. There's also, we really have a naive concept in the population. And that naive concept is that if we don't get our RDA, then there's going to be a deficiency. That's it. And we don't see that because some people have that lower requirement. And then if you step over that RDA amount, well, then there's a problem. And we don't see that in many individuals as well. What we need to keep in mind here is that there's a scale. There's an area too low, danger of deficiency, and that is going to affect homeostasis dramatically. Both in your repair, you see people who get a bruise and heal in 3 days. You see people that get a bruise not on a blood thinner and take weeks to heal. That tends to be frequently related to a malnutrition concept. Okay, then we're going to have marginal, and we're not very good in the medical field of figuring out what's a marginal or a subclinical deficiency. We don't know where that is. And so frequently we have to wait for someone to get sick enough to observe the deficiency. We've got our RDAs, which are considered a safe level. Then once again, we go back into the marginals. Some people have problems, other people may not. And then danger of toxicity. Now, on the GotNutrients website and in the literature in the last 6 to 7 months, there's more and more information that heart attacks may be linked to excess calcium. We may need to really watch excess calcium with some individuals. And, you know, I know at least in many instances, women are taking large amounts of calcium. And Dr. Tichenor and I and some other colleagues actually looked at what nationwide people were doing just with some of the calcium fortified cereals. And we thought maybe we'd only see young high school age boys might sit down and actually put away a half a box of Total cereal. Obviously putting in way more than what would be needed, or any of the cereals that are fortified with over 100% of the calcium. That's not what we found. We actually found a number of senior citizens, because of the convenience of cereal, actually eating 3 and 4 and 5 servings. Serving is only 3/4 of a cup. So in a day, they might be exceeding their upper limit by 2 or 3 times the amount that someone should be getting. And then they're also taking calcium supplements because that's recommended either by their physician or it's recommended in the media that everyone needs to take calcium. Okay, so now we're on to just examples of some of these. I'm bringing up iron so frequently for the reason that it is the most prevalent deficiency in the world and in the nation. 2 billion people have iron deficiency, and probably in America 1 in 5 females of reproductive age. I know in many of the classes that I teach at the University of Hawaii, it is not unusual for 50% or more of the female individuals to be iron deficient. Causes: insufficient dietary iron. Sustainability has changed a lot of people's concept of consuming beef or chicken thigh. Low bioavailability of iron in foods, and blood loss. And blood loss can be due to pregnancy, it can be due fast growth as in infancy or adolescence. They tend to hurt themselves, skateboard problems, etc. going on. We've got, we also have inadequate GI absorption that can occur. So if your diet doesn't have adequate protein or other nutrients, you may not have adequate amounts of absorption going on. There's lots of malabsorption syndromes now. We've got gluten intolerance. We've got Crohn's disease happening more and more. We've got different drugs that affect this. We've got over-the-counter We've got the NSAIDs, the calcium, zinc. We've got low bioavailability caused by coffee and tea, colored beans. You know, we're talking about polyphenols. These are all really good for long-term health, but they also inhibit iron in meals. So a white bean does not inhibit iron the same way as a red bean does. We've got red wine, alcohol, and milk, calcium, milk and calcium fortified foods. So we also have sweat loss, which we see in lots of our athletes. And in Hawaii, this is more and more important to keep in mind. Swimmers also lose sweat, and they can be losing. So our blood loss is, maybe why it affects women more. We've got menstruation, but blood donations. There's countries like France which actually will not allow a blood donation more than twice a year because of the ability to be able to absorb adequate iron. Birth, you lose nearly a year worth of iron stores in giving birth. There's various trauma, surgeries, GI bleeding, dialysis. You also have iron deficiency pretty frequently. Now, we've got to get out of this concept of on-off switches. Nutrient deficiency just doesn't turn on or turn off. If it took you a year to become deficient enough to be able to be picked up by blood tests, it may take you a year or more to reverse it. We've got these restrictions on bioavailability for good reasons. Iron is also a toxin. So it's about balance. We should think about nutrients in terms of sliders. So essentially, because of genes, however, someone may first have thinning of hair where somebody else may have becoming cold. Somebody may have not being able to sleep. It's going to vary because of our different gene. Now, what are examples of common conditions affected by inadequate consumption of a single absorption? Iron deficiency. Okay. ADHD. An iron deficient individual has very similar brain waves to one of someone that's ADHD. And by far the majority of females ADHD, are female. All right? We've got anemia, autism. Boys with autism, which is the predominant group, boys when they're born actually have less iron than girls do. And they tend to build up their iron stores over time. I am not saying in any way, shape, or form that iron is the sole cause of autism. It's definitely not. But it may, in fact, up or down regulate genes that are going to play a factor. We've got cognitive function, memory issues. We've got depression. Many individuals with depression have very low iron stores. And getting them up, what I've also found is that in the clinic where I work at the University of Hawaii, that many individuals who have been on antidepressants can eventually get off of them as they get their iron stores more normalized. We've got esophageal reflux, GERD. You don't digest adequately, and iron deficiency has been shown to affect the parietal cells. These are cells in the stomach that produce hydrochloric acid. That's really important because if you don't form adequate hydrochloric acid, you're not going to digest, and GERD is more likely to happen. You've got fatigue, you've got gallbladder issues, headaches, hypothyroid, immune system, insomnia, insulin resistance before diabetes has been shown with low iron. So maybe we need to be actually looking at overall status rather than waiting till after the fact. Frequently in medicine, we're not sure which came first, the chicken or the egg. So did the insulin resistance from a nutrient deficiency help coax someone into diabetes? And obviously Hawaii has some real serious issues with diabetes. So something we might want to look at. Respiratory problems of all sorts, restless leg syndrome, and weight gain. Individuals frequently with lower levels, is it because they're fatigued so they don't exercise as readily, or is it because they're breaking down their muscle to dump some iron from their muscle into their blood in order to deal with all the other functions and keep homeostasis going? We know that iron's required for thyroid function, but frequently we say that when someone has a thyroid problem, oh yeah, they're iron deficient after the fact. Maybe it's really the other way around. We look at various and sundry brain formation and brain chemicals, dopamine, serotonin for maintaining not just depression, but overall well-being. We're looking also at liver. Your whole detox system are heme-containing proteins. So when individuals all of a sudden become very sensitive to drugs that they're taking in the medical field, possibly they're not breaking it down because they don't have the same equipment in order to break it down. So why aren't we seeing this? And then heart also uses carnitine. This particular chemical is important for the transport of fatty acids. And without the synthesis of carnitine, which iron is needed for, then the heart doesn't have adequate fuel. So when we look at the physiological states affecting iron bioavailability, the medical belief essentially is the adequate body iron stores are identified by anemia. The physiological reality is standard blood tests may or may not pick up the indices of iron status. A study that Brian Hill, one of my graduate students, has shown, and we're looking at the large national data bank, the NHANES data bank, which has, right now there are over 50,000 people in this data bank. What we found is an NHANES 2, 65% of the females that were absolutely low in iron by any medical professionals' evaluation of the protein called ferritin, which is an indicator of iron stores, 65% were missed. They weren't seen with anemia. We found males were missed 20% of the time. Now, there were less males than females in this study, and NHANES 3 showed the same trend, and we're now looking at all of the data all the way through, and a thesis should come out this semester on this topic, but the pattern is there. We're missing individuals. If someone goes to donate blood, they could be missed because they're looking at the wrong indices for iron deficiency. Now, I'm switching a little over to show you how this may happen. We don't know how this happens, but as an example, with sodium depletion, it can cause something called hemoconcentration. Now, we see sodium depletion fairly often in anorexia nervosa cases. All right? People are more and more concerned about sodium. Anorexics typically are not keen on any potential thing that will cause them to be 1/10 of a pound heavier. So in fact, what we actually see is something more like, because of hydration status, you can get, here's an example of normal blood, but you can get low blood. This is what would be expected in if we were looking at a blood sample with a normal blood test with the physicians, the complete blood count, CBC, or hemoconcentration. So as more and more people are eliminating sodium from their diet, the greater the chance we're going to see hemoconcentration and misread blood tests. I think that is really critical. We understand that potential, because all of a sudden, and individuals that I've worked with, literally adding in people with high blood pressure, it's not unusual for me to add in chicken bouillon and V8 juice to get the sodium up, to then get them into a normal level. Obviously, this is medical nutrition therapy. you have to really know the individual. You don't just broadcast, well, if you have, high blood pressure, take this. This is done carefully, knowing what the individuals are consuming. Non-anemic iron deficiency can be extremely costly. People can end up literally going through thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars of medical tests because the wrong blood tests were done because they weren't anemic. I would say that this is a huge cost to our health care, and know of situations where HMSA and Kaiser have spent well over $50,000 to find an iron deficiency. So that's per individual. I think this is important that we step back and say, we need to take a better look at health care and get appropriate recommendations. There was some research that came out that said maybe iron is causing heart disease and heart attacks. That has been refuted very clearly, very well, but it's still dogma in many cases. Now, just to show you that it's not just my list, I've put up 2 articles. One's on symptom panorama in school kids and their symptoms with iron. Here, iron deficiency in students in common conditions in health care at schools and general practice. This was done in Scandinavia. But some of the symptoms I'm going to show you, in fact, are sort of normal kids, which makes it harder to diagnose. We've got to get better at all of this. So symptoms, dizziness, vertigo, these can all be common symptoms in students, but students with iron deficiency as well. And this particular radar graph essentially shows that in terms of normal, or all the students lumped together, which are the black line here, you see that all of these symptoms, whether vertigo, eye complaints, hearing, fatigue, sleep, sweating, breathlessness, coughing, irritability, and on, overweight, you see it in the whole population, but you also see it in a study that looked at the most strict view of iron deficiency. And in those cases, the gray symptoms here, the symptoms are actually more exaggerated. We also see in individuals when someone comes in, and iron is really that nutrient that probably is a gender equity issue, by far, by far. It's the highest in women. It's negated, for decades. Women that have been depressed or have had issues or come in fatigued, they look at the anemia, they don't see anything, they think it's in their head. And because of this conscious thought pattern, and all of the original work actually was done on men and then just extrapolated to women. So I'm not sure that we can use that same analogy, because men have a bigger muscle mass. They can actually break down their muscle to dump more iron into the blood when needed and rebuild, and women don't have that same luxury many times. So there are a number, I have 800 papers that indicate iron deficiency, not necessarily with anemia, are causing problems. I'm only showing a few. And then here, a chronic cough, who would ever thought? But these are the respiratory things. Now, is it just iron, where a chronic cough, no explainable reason? No, it's not. And we're starting to see with B12 deficiency. We're seeing that same type of issue come up. So there are additional blood tests that are going to need to be ordered. And this is going to get pretty complicated as we go down and change health care. We're going to need to get more physicians educated in nutrition so that they can make better judgments in terms of their tests. Choline is the last B vitamin that was discovered. And it was discovered very recently. It was discovered in humans only because of the reason that people stopped eating eggs. We knew it existed in many animal species. We knew it was critical for spinal neural tube. We knew it critical for brain function. We knew it critical for multiple areas in the body. We never saw it in humans until people stopped eating the egg yolk. One egg yolk a day actually will give you half of your requirement. If you don't eat essentially an egg a day or red meat, you're probably deficient. And that's from unless you're eating close to 3,000 calories, and lots of individuals aren't. So because of the effect on depression, brain chemicals, etc., choline is really important to keep in mind. We've thought about the leading causes of death: heart disease, cancer, stroke, lung disease, pneumonia, diabetes, liver disease, and it's always been linked to, let's take this out of your diet. Maybe it's actually because of taking some of the things out of the diet that we're having issues, rather than we're eating too much. It's pretty interesting when you look at things such as protein intake. Protein intake is such that if you're getting adequate protein intake, you don't have much of a sweet tooth. That sweet tooth is well upregulated in all animal species when you don't have enough. So essentially the recommendations are quantity of food, decreasing it, and rather than bioavailability in foods that are nutrient dense, that have a large amount of those nutrients, or decrease calories, and frequently promoting decreased protein and going more meatless. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't people that are overeating in terms of red meat. There are. There clearly are. But there are lots of people that have literally eliminated it from their diet for fear. And why this becomes critically important as we're looking at the whole obesity and weight issue is when you look at how many calories per gram of protein consumed, your lowest calories are in lean beef, chicken, fish, egg, and cottage cheese. By far the lowest calories. As you move up to other dairy and tofu, you're now doubling the calories per gram of protein. To beans, you're going up to 24. So from 8, 16, 24 grains for your protein, 30 calories per gram of protein, and nuts, 36 calories per gram of protein. The heavier a person is, the higher the protein requirement is, because protein is based on your body weight. The dietary recommendations, whether it's in My Plate or My Pyramid, etc., were actually based on an old number, so that the levels are recommending much lower than our average children require. One other factor here is when we're looking at nutrients, frequently we want to blame lots of foods. We want to blame things on eggs and potatoes and red meat and chips. But in fact, when you look at what's happened per capita, now this is the changes in calories consumed per capita from selected food groups. We've got our oils, now that's also from salad dressings, as the biggest culprit from 1970 up to 2010. This is disappearance data, but a reflection of what the population's doing. We then see that flour and cereal products are the next place where we have calories coming. We then have high fructose corn syrup, and we have cheese, and we have nuts, and then we have chips and shoestring, pretty much staying about the same, shoestring potatoes, and then we've got eggs, we've got unfried potatoes, and we've got red meat. But you would think from most of the messages that we're getting that individuals are eating way too much of the potatoes and the red meat and the eggs, when in fact that has not been shown. So healthcare recommendations should be based on nutrition science, all right? We need to identify essential nutrients for growth, repair, and reproduction. We need all health professionals to realize which ones they are. We need to determine amounts of essential nutrients that are required to prevent deficiencies and to determine effectiveness of therapeutic and preventive measures. Then, in terms of nutritional epidemiology, so this is essentially evaluating risk, not on individuals, we should be used to detect relationships and trends between exposure and health and estimate health services. And we should look nutrition recommendations based solely on epidemiology can be problematic. More fruits and vegetables. I've actually had a patient eating 27 fruits and vegetables a day and still being told to take in more because more doesn't have a number. We know what are safe levels. Two very recent studies, Bruce Ames and James Watson of DNA fame, James Ames of cancer test fame out of Berkeley, both older researchers have said, we have to watch out. Too much of an antioxidant is dangerous and likely promotes cancer. These are well-respected researchers. GotNutrients, that's essentially why HONSAC started this, was to get the concept across that, in fact, we need people to understand there are reasons for food. And when we get out of balance, that's at homeostasis balance, we're going to have problems. No food is really a bad food. It's about proportion. It's about moderation. It's about variety. The GotNutrients site, we've got on this site all of the old tips. So we're 3 or more years, 2009 started. And we update if there is more recent information. We tend to not put on here studies that are not looking at everything. So in other words, maybe studies should be looked at beef versus beef with vegetables, people that eat. But the studies typically are you eat beef or you don't eat beef. You eat this or you don't eat it, rather than looking at how complex we are as humans. GotNutrients is the first step to maintaining or regaining health, but exercise is critical because it allows us to be able to consume more calories, which will allow us to get in our nutrients without gaining extra fat, staying a good body composition. Let medicine be thy food and food be thy medicine. I think we've gotten away from that. Right now, we seem to be saying, don't eat this and don't eat that, instead of really looking at what we should be. Thank you. And if there are any questions, I'll be glad to